Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. I'm Mark Stein, in for Tucker, who's taking a European Union-length Christmas break, which is revoltingly un-American of him. Today was the deadline for the Department of Justice to turn over requested information about anti-Trump text messages to the Senate Judiciary Committee. The text messages were sent by former Robert Mueller team member Peter Strzok and are a powerful sign that Mueller's probe and other FBI investigations could be tainted by political bias. Senator Chuck Grassley has demanded that the DOJ explain both when it found the messages and how it has reacted to them. Will that information be handed over? So far, it apparently hasn't been, but the DOJ and FBI have repeatedly demonstrated that they consider these requests from Congress to be mere suggestions at best. Richard Goodstein advised Hillary Clinton's campaign in both 2008 and 2016. Richard, it's not a small thing when the people's representatives get flipped the finger by rogue law enforcement agencies, is it?
Mark, can I just say you introduced me as a Hillary person. It must have really hurt when the Gallup poll said again that Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton were the most admired man and woman in the world. But let me answer your question.
I'll give you that one. On the entire planet.
Yeah,
That was the question. If only the Electoral College included the jungles of Papua New Guinea,
exactly,
she'd be sitting in the Oval Office
My
today.
sentiments precisely.
I'll give you that one in the spirit of New Year comedy.
Look, this whole business about Peter Strzok's text messages is yet another distraction. Donald Trump should thank his lucky stars that the FBI existed. He would not be in the White House but for James Comey having given his press conference on July 5th, sent that letter on October 28th, and making no reference whatsoever to what the intelligence community knew, which was that the Russians were trying to help Trump win. Nothing, not a word. So for him and, frankly, his party members now to be screaming bloody murder about the FBI, it's just a bit much.
No, well, wait a minute. This guy Strzok, for example, He's got Senator Grassley has read this text message from Peter Strzok, who's a senior counterintelligence guy, even though he writes text messages to his sweetheart like a sixth-grade schoolgirl. It is a serious situation when the plain meaning of the text suggests that in Andrew McCabe's office, the number 2 FBI guy's office, they are talking about how to, in effect, interfere with the election to ensure that Trump doesn't become president. That would be bad if they were doing it to Hillary. It would be bad if they were doing it to Jill Stein. Doesn't that require an answer from these guys?
They were saying that at a time when the FBI was putting its weight on the scales in favor of Donald Trump. Seriously, this is perverse. I understand, again, the walls are kind of closing in on Donald Trump with the Flynn plea, with the Papadopoulos plea.
No.
And seriously, look, Mark, I would say this. You know who said really bad things about Donald Trump? Marco Rubio said he was a con artist. Ted Cruz said he was utterly amoral and a pathological liar. Peter Strzok wasn't unique.
And Trump said Ted Cruz's father was on the grassy knoll with Lee Harvey Oswald. That's just part of the give and take of politics.
Well,
put that to one side. What we're talking about here are policemen. We're talking about here, if Trump wants to accuse Cruz's father of being on the grassy knoll, that's one thing. When policemen are, as you put it, putting their thumb on the scale, that's quite another matter.
Well, except it's belied by the fact that what the FBI ultimately did, they put its weight, the Comey press conference, the Comey letter, the non-disclosure of what the intelligence community knew about what the Russians were doing to help Trump. That's basically Trump's everything. That supersedes anything that Peter Strzok could possibly. Incidentally, when Peter Strzok was doing interviews, Mark, he had other people there in the FBI. He didn't have any kind of solo opportunity to kind of move things one way or the other. Did he like Trump? No. A lot of people didn't.
You said a fascinating thing there, Richard. What the Russians were doing to help Trump. What were they doing?
I'll tell you, 4 things, keep in mind.
Yeah.
They said to Donald Trump Jr., we can help you. Donald Trump Jr. said, love it, let's see it. And then guess what? The Russians did help through WikiLeaks, and Donald Trump 100 times during the campaign made reference to WikiLeaks and urged them to do more, to basically steal from Hillary Clinton's computer. And then, of course, all the people in the Trump orbit lied about it.
Nobody had to steal from any Democrats. John Podesta's password was password with a 0 for where the O should be. So John Podesta and Hillary Clinton might as well have left their emails on top of a payphone in Grand Central Station. You don't have to steal them.
That's like saying that the Watergate break-in would not have happened had that lock been a bit more secure, that those burglars couldn't have quite cracked it had there had been a better lock. Come on, it was theft. It was theft.
Come on here, Richard. We hear this thing, they may have hacked into voting machines. You can't hack into something that isn't connected to the internet. That's like hacking into a cinnamon bun. You can't do it.
I totally agree that we right now don't have evidence about the voting machines. But here's what we do have evidence of. We know that there's some crackpot from North Carolina came up to Washington, D.C. with a rifle because there was some loony thing that was put out by the Russians about a child slavery ring in a pizza place, and he was prepared to shoot people. You think people might be prepared to vote differently? This guy was prepared to shoot people because of what he read on the internet.
Come on, we had a Bernie Sanders guy shooting up the congressional baseball-playing Republicans. We have that's not on Bernie Sanders. Bernie is one of my neighbors in northern New England, and I think he's a kook, but I don't think he incentivizes people to murder. You can't make that connection.
You're downplaying the significance of what was put out on the internet by the Russians, okay? I'm saying the point I made was Exhibit A. That was something that was specifically done by the Russians, and a guy was prepared to travel hundreds of miles to shoot people. That suggests to me that somebody may be able to have their vote influenced. That's all.
Well, that's interesting to hear from campaign officials, because if that guy Putin can swing an election for 100 grand, you guys are out of business, Richard, because nobody needs to pay millions to the big fancy pants consultants when 100 grand to some guy in Moscow can swing the election for you.
Let me just, two things, Mark. We will see when the Podesta emails came out an hour after Access Hollywood. Was that a coincidence, or was there some collaboration? And we will see when all these swing voters in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania were targeted by Russians. Was that all done by Russians, or were there any Americans that were involved? Those are the questions that Mueller, I bet, will get to the bottom of, and I don't think the answer will reflect well on the Trump campaign.
As I said, Richard, that the whole consultant industrial complex has gone up in smoke if some rinky-dink Ruski over in Moscow could just swing it for you. It isn't just text messages hurting the legitimacy of Mueller's investigation, of course. The FBI's infamous reliance on the Trump dossier is doing a good job as well. Republican Congressman Ron DeSantis of Florida says that use of the dossier undermines the basic legitimacy of the FBI's warrant to investigate the Trump campaign following last year's election. And Congressman DeSantis joins us now. This is a very interesting legal point you made. If this dossier was the pretext for the entire investigation, it's a kind of almost absurd fruits of the poisonous tree thing, in that it's not a legitimate pretext for an investigation. Is that correct?
Yeah, just think about where this dossier came from. This was paid for by Hillary Clinton, the Democratic Party. They paid millions of dollars to Perkins Cole law firm, who then laundered it to Fusion GPS. So you have Fusion GPS producing this thing. I think Christopher Steele was more of a cover to make it look like an intelligence product. But to this day, the FBI can't verify anything in it other than one person associated with Trump traveled to Russia at some point. So this stuff is bogus, it's fake news, and you expect that kind of stuff to be generated in the course of a political campaign. But if that is presented to the FBI and then they're taking that that unverified dossier and launching a federal counterintelligence investigation without anything more, to me, that raises some serious questions. And was it Peter Strzok who was involved? Remember, the key text message was he was in Andrew McCabe's office and they were talking about, Lisa Page said, oh, Donald Trump can't win. And Strzok says, you know, I don't think the FBI can take that risk. We need an insurance policy basically against Trump's election. So the question is, was that dossier and the subsequent investigation and surveillance the insurance policy he referenced in those text messages?
And what you're saying here is that it comes before a FISA judge who isn't an expert in intelligence matters, but it's got the FBI imprimatur. It's kind of got an MI6 imprimatur because the spook appears to have credentials. And in a sense, it would appear to be a plausible document if laid before a judge. Is that correct?
Well, that's the question. You know, we've asked the Department of Justice, the FBI, to give us the information about how the dossier got in their possession. Did they pay for the dossier, and how did they use the dossier? Did they use it as the basis to get these FISA warrants? And they've basically refused to answer those questions. This is going to come to a head because I think you're going to see a contempt of Congress if they don't produce this to the Intelligence Committee. But that's the question. And here's the thing, Mark. If the answer to all those questions was no, then they would just say no. The fact that they haven't, to me, raises some serious questions.
Well, you've said that they've been looking at this thing for a year and a half now, and Christopher Steele cooked it up in a few weeks. They've been unable to corroborate anything except that some guy at some point got on a plane to Russia, but they don't know what he did once he got off the plane in Russia. How many more months or years do they need to supposedly attempt to corroborate this nonsense?
Look, I think it's time to put up or shut up. This whole thing started, obviously after Strzok and these guys started the counterintelligence. When Mueller got appointed, I think Rosenstein made a big mistake because what he was doing was he was superimposing a criminal prosecutor on top of a counterintelligence investigation. Right. And how good of an investigation that was, obviously, there's a lot of concern about that. But there's never been a crime identified here. You can believe that Russia tried to hack different people's email accounts, but that doesn't mean that there was a criminal conspiracy with Trump's campaign, and there's never been information provided to substantiate that. So I think if he can't answer that question, then I think we need to move on. I think you are going to see the committees in Congress move on, and I think the result is going to be no collusion.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Congressman. Thanks for that. More liberals are turning on Hillary Clinton. We'll discuss a liberal magazine that is begging her not to run again next. And we'll show you President Obama's attack on the power of social media. All that coming next.
Suits or The Good Wife?
Suits, obviously.
Great answer. Cigarettes or gum?
Gum now, baby.
Gum. White House or Buckingham Palace?
White House, just because Buckingham Palace looks like it would take a really long time to mow.
Okay, fair enough.
A lot of upkeep.
Queen or the Queen?
The Queen.
Okay, good answer again. The Rock or Chris Rock?
That's an interesting question. I like them both.
Slip and slide or electric slide?
Electric slide. That's my generation.
Fantastic answer. And lastly, your last $5, buy a burger or buy a lottery ticket?
It depends on how good the burger is.
Wow, there's a guest host. As a matter of interest, Prince Harry and I are identical twins, separated at birth. Hard-hitting topics there. President Obama giving his first sit-down interview since leaving office. The former president giving that interview to His Royal Highness. Obama spoke quite a bit about himself, but he also took an indirect yet very clear shot at President Trump, blasting leaders, he says, are warping public discourse via social media.
The question, I think, really has to do with how do we harness this technology in a way that allows a multiplicity of voices, allows a diversity of views, but doesn't lead to a balkanization of our society, but rather continues to promote ways of finding common ground. Mm-hmm. And all of us in leadership have to find ways in which we can recreate a common space on the internet. Mm-hmm.
Wendy Osefo is an education professor. Wendy, putting aside the idea of a president talking to a prince about how it's the rest of us who are living in danger of living in a bubble, what do you think he was getting at here? Was it a shot at Trump, or was it a more general observation?
It was a more general observation. Right now, the current climate, not just in our country, but overseas as well, is one where everything is volatile, and people need to be mindful, especially those in power, of the decisions that they make. And that's what Obama was speaking to, and I think is a poignant point, especially right now.
Well, isn't there a danger, though, in world leaders, the establishment, the elite, saying everything would be better if we didn't have balkanized multiple voices? When the internet started, one of the great things it did was it freed people from the default setting of mainstream media, which is surely liberal. That's surely the bubble, isn't it?
It's not necessarily the bubble, and I wouldn't say that mainstream media is liberal. That's not true. Look at the network that we're on right here. So again, you know, when we try to make those type of narratives and we try to make those overarching statements, that exactly negates what he's trying to say there. You know, mainstream media, at the end of the day, has a level of responsibility, and our leaders, our elected officials, have a tantamount level of responsibility, and they need to make sure that everything they're doing and the policies that they're set forth is not just one that impacts their own bubble, but impacts all of us as citizens.
What about the idea that beyond the media, the default setting of our society now, by which I mean not just media, but motion pictures, churches, schools, the default setting of our society is essentially liberal. If you go to school, you'll learn essentially the liberal view on climate change. If you go to church, you'll get the liberal view on climate change. What's wrong with balkanizing that just a little?
I reject that premise. I don't believe it's the liberal view. I actually think it's the popular view. And that's something that conservatives have to start to accept. It's not necessarily that there's a war against people who are conservative or who have right-leaning ideologies. It's more so that overall, when we look at issues, they tend to lean on the left side. And that's just the truth of the matter. We cannot negate the fact that the popular view often leans to the left. That does not negate, you know, individuals who are conservative by any means. And what's really important here, if I could just underscore this, is that Americans need allies. The United States needs allies. But the volatile behavior of President Trump makes that increasingly more difficult. So we need to start addressing that as well.
Well, we'll see who winds up sitting at in the third row at Prince Harry's wedding on that one, Wendy. The magazine Vanity Fair is positively begging Hillary Clinton not to run for president again. Take a look at this.
It's time to start working on your sequel to your book, What Happened? What the hell happened?
Get someone on your tech staff to disable autofill on your iPhone so that typing an F doesn't become Form Exploratory Committee for 2020.
You know, on Anderson Cooper, you were telling him about alternate nostril breathing. You seem really adept. You should try teaching a class.
Take more photos in the woods. How else are you going to meet unsuspecting hikers?
Take up a new hobby in the new year. Volunteer work, knitting, improv comedy, literally anything that'll keep you from running again.
To finally put away your James Comey voodoo doll. Now, we all know you think that James Comey cost you the election, and he might have, but so did a handful of other things. It's a year later, and time to move on.
So cheers to you, Hillary Clinton.
Cheers to you, Hillary.
Cheers to you, Hillary Clinton.
I hope they didn't pay big money for those jokes. Wendy, liberals are going nuts over this. I mean, people are saying it's time to burn copies of Vanity Fair, that so-called progressives have no business telling an accomplished woman that she needs to take up knitting, that's sexist. But you do get the sense, though, that Democrats are moving on from Hillary.
Yeah, I think Democrats are moving on from Hillary. I think that the uproar came because we have individuals who ran for presidency like John McCain, like Mitt Romney. And, you know, we did not see this type of uproar for them to leave it. This is a woman that, yes, she did not win the vote. Yes, we know that she's not the president of the United States. But to use such language and say take up knitting, this is her life's work. She's the Secretary of State. She's the first female to run for office for a major political party. And then to say to take up knitting? No, she has built a body of work, and she doesn't have to be president, but she can continue to extend her political realm.
Well, what's killed her? Is it the fact that in the midst of this book tour, Harvey Weinstein and Charlie Rose and Matt Lauer came along and recast her husband and their marriage in a new light? Is that part of the problem here?
I don't think that that necessarily killed her because she didn't win the vote. It didn't help her by any means, especially that photo going around of her and Harvey Weinstein looking very, very chummy and comfortable. That didn't help her. But again, to sit there and say that she should take up knitting when she has done a lot in the political realm is not, it doesn't make any sense at all.
Do you regret that your party, Progressive Party, wants to shatter the glass ceiling, as Canada, Britain, Australia, New Zealand, Germany, on and on and on have done, but it chose the wife of the previous president? Isn't that a little bit... You say she's an accomplished woman?
She is.
Her main accomplishment is that she was the wife of the guy who held the job before.
You see, and that in itself is sexist, right? That's not her major accomplishment. She was the Secretary of State. She is the first woman to run on a major political party, and she got that vote. So that's not her major accomplishment, that she's the wife of Bill Clinton. By all means, no, she's done other things. Was she the best candidate for our party? No, she was not. However, to say that her major accomplishment was being a wife, that's what we talk about when we say sexism in the political sphere.
Okay, I stand reprimanded, Wendy. France's, I'll try to do better. France's government is scrambling to deal with a wave of migrants that has flooded its streets. Up next, we'll try to see what lessons the US can learn for our own migrant situation here. That's next. To deal with the country's migrant problem. President Emmanuel Macron ran as a comparative liberal, but he wants homeless migrants off France's streets by year's end. That probably isn't going to happen, so now the French are cracking down. Authorities are ramping up expulsions, checking IDs at emergency shelters, and doing a host of other measures to get migrants out of the country and keep them out. Does France have a lesson for America's own migration issues? David Tafuri is a former State Department official and advised the Obama campaign on foreign policy. David, it's always interesting to see how countries that have reputations as being more liberal and progressive deal with some of these issues. France expels 1 in 5 illegal immigrants. If Trump did that, he would literally be Hitler, even more literally Hitler than he already literally is, wouldn't he? 1 in 5 illegal immigrants get expelled from France.
Well, I wouldn't agree with that characterization, but you're right. Macron is doing some interesting things with respect to migration policy in France, and these are things that France needs to do. Here's some of the things it's doing. As you mentioned, it's getting some of the migrants off the streets, but it's trying to get some of them into shelters. It is also setting up centers in Africa for those who are asylum seekers to be identified and observed and chosen from Africa so that they know before they go to France whether they're going to get asylum or not. That's also very important for limiting those who are going to go expecting to get asylum and not get asylum. But one of the most important things that Macron is doing is he's distinguishing between economic migrants and political asylum seekers, or those who are refugees that meet the standard for refugee, meaning they have a well-founded fear or of death or injury if they're returned to their country of origin. And he's accepting asylum seekers, true refugees, and he said France is still open for refugees, whereas economic migrants he's trying to discourage from coming to France. And that's something that we can learn as well. It's something we should be doing, but President Trump has not made that distinction in his policy thus far.
Well, no, because everyone knows that the refugee system and that status of a genuine fear of persecution is abused routinely in the immigration systems of the West. France is, if you go to Paris, for example, and you can go a couple of blocks from the best hotels, the Georges V or the Plaza Athénée, and you would think you were in a country and a city that has fallen apart. A beautiful city with streets piled with trash. The jungle camp at Calais that they shut down has basically moved to the capital city now. Is this not a warning of what happens when essentially you have let anybody who can walk into your country stay in your country?
Well, that's why Macron is doing some of the things that he's doing. He's trying to make the streets safer. He's also trying to make it safer for some of these migrants by moving them off the streets and moving them into shelters. But I want to go back to one other characterization you mentioned, which I don't agree with. Asylum seekers in the U.S. are not problematic. Actually, the refugees who have come to the U.S. and have been resettled here as refugees have not engaged in crime. Their crime rate is less than the average American, and they've not engaged in terrorism. None of the major terrorist attacks. Well, hold on a second. None of the major terrorist attacks in the U.S. have been due to refugees. They're from people who came to the U.S. in other ways.
No, what about the Somalis in Minnesota, for example, who go back to Somalia? They supposedly here because it's unsafe for them to go back to Somalia, but they fly back to Somalia, strap on the old suicide belt, and your State Department pays to have the 50,000 fragments of whatever's left of them shipped back for burial in Minnesota.
Mark, you got to look at the statistics. I mean, you can pull out one, crazy situation, but if you look at the statistics, asylum seekers and refugees in the United States have not engaged in crime and they have not engaged in terrorism. And it's because our asylum process has a very substantial vetting procedure. They're vetted overseas. It takes 2 years for them to go through that vetting process. They're interrogated. They go through questioning and background checks. And by the time they make it here through that difficult process, they normally are law-abiding citizens who contribute to our society. Now, I agree with you, though, that we have to do a better job of limiting those who come from overseas who do engage in terrorist attacks, and there are many who have done that, but they have not come as refugees. They've come through other ways. They've come on visitation visas. They've come on family visas. They've come through other means, and those are the ones that we should be more focused upon.
Well, what's the answer to that? Because if you look at the situation of Europe to Africa, it's actually more severe than North America to South America. Because if you look at the differential in birth rates, a very tiny proportion of the population of Africa, countries where people have 6, 7 children, and they can't support the present population, the incentive to just get on a boat and, as Tucker showed on this show a couple of months ago, just arrive on a beach in Spain where all the nice continentals are sunbathing topless and walk into Europe. What's to prevent people from just walking into the developed world and overwhelming it?
I've read some of your articles on the aging statistics that you mentioned, and they are very interesting and thoughtful. And I think you make some good points there. One of the ways, though, we stop migration from Africa to Europe, as you mentioned, is to set up these centers in Africa. So there are staging centers there where people can apply, and they'll know whether they're going to be given refugee status or not. But ultimately, we also have to do more to turn these countries that are becoming failed states into more stable, prosperous countries, so people do not want to leave them. That's going to take a lot more engagement by Europe. Europe is not doing enough in Africa to stabilize these countries.
Europe used to do enough, and it's called colonialism and imperialism. And it's actually very hard, isn't it, to do it at one remove by just giving money to international aid and development things.
Well, that's not just what I'm talking about. And obviously, there's something in between colonialism and zero engagement. We have to be engaged. We have to be promoting democracy. We have to be promoting economic prosperity. And we have to make these countries safe and prosperous and stable so the people stay there and they don't seek illegal migration.
Thanks for coming on, David. We'll try and find where that sweet spot is. Cash is as old as civilization, but has technology made it obsolete? Up next, Tucker's back to talk to an economist who says it's time for an all-electronic economy. That's next.
Almost since the dawn of civilization, cash money, has been a critical piece of the world's economy. In ancient times, people used gold and silver coins. Today, paper money remains the single most popular way to make transactions in this country. But should it be? Some economists say day-to-day shopping can easily be done electronically, while the continued use of cash hurts the economy and may even cause crime. Kenneth Rogoff is a Harvard professor, a former chief economist at the International Monetary Fund, a famous chess player. He says it's time to move forward toward a cashless society. Professor Rogoff joins us tonight. Professor, thanks for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
So I've heard this argument before, and I understand and I take seriously the inefficiencies of cash and the possibilities for crime, transnational crime, it avails to criminals. I get all that. But there's also the suspicion that a lot of us have that eliminating it would just increase government power, maybe to a point that's dangerous. Is that a concern for you?
Absolutely. So I actually don't favor getting rid of cash. I favor getting rid of large bills like the 50 and the 100 and similar around the world. I think if you look at the use of cash, actually, by quantity of transactions, it's nowhere near the most popular. It's fallen out. It's behind for purchases over, $50. It's behind, debit cards, credit cards, electronic payments. But for small payments, it's very convenient. And of course, sometimes somebody wants to do something for $5,000, even $100,000. They don't want anyone to know. But you can carry a suitcase of $10 bills, a briefcase of $10 bills of $100,000. 20 pounds, if you have to do that once in a while. We shouldn't go cashless, but I do think if you look at the declining use of cash and the rising printing of these big bills, we ought to realize it's for tax evasion. That's much bigger than crime. And if you can cut back on tax evasion, you could, for example, lower tax rates.
So you do acknowledge, though, it sounds like you are acknowledging that people have an inherent instinct, a desire for privacy. They don't necessarily want anybody, whether it's a bank or the Treasury Department, tracking what they're doing with their money. And that's okay, you think?
Yeah, well, okay, there's a big difference between somebody doing a wholesale business where they're doing $50,000, $100,000 in transactions every week, and they don't want the government to know, and somebody who's doing something on a much smaller scale. And I think these wholesale transactions are facilitated by these big bills, big drug kingpins, tax evasion is a huge thing. So I just think we need to recalibrate it a little bit, not so much eliminate it.
Are you worried about the vulnerabilities of a digital system? We're moving in that direction anyway. But I mean, the beauty of cash is it's tangible. You can hide it under your bed. No one can hack a $100 bill. Are you concerned about that?
Well, I'm very concerned about cybersecurity. On the other hand, I think if we have a problem, hanging on to the rump of cash that we have left in our system's not going to save us. We need to protect ourselves. But yeah, that's, if you have a big storm that knocks out the power system, God forbid an EMP blast or something, it's very useful to have some rump of cash left there. Although, people have been very inventive when that's happened in the past with checks, IOUs, and other things. But no, we don't want to get rid of cash completely. But I do think if you look at what the government's printing, there's almost pushing over $4,500 for every man, woman, and child in the United States. And there are lots of surveys, even if you take the part that's out of the country, the average person's holding, maybe a couple hundred, $200-300, counting in their house, counting in their car. They're not holding $4,500, much less their kids.
No, they're not. Quickly, what do you make of Bitcoin? Where does that fall in the spectrum?
Well, I mean, Bitcoin's great innovation, but the part of it that's anonymous, eventually the government has to apply anti-money laundering rules, tax rules, and other things. I mean, the government can't just look the other way and let people do giant transactions, transnational, national, and not care about it. It's going to get regulated. I think the long run, Bitcoin's great technology, but it's more likely to look like MySpace that lost out to Facebook than it is to look like the next big thing.
Right, because it is a threat to the government in the end, and you never win threatening the government.
In the currency game, the government makes the rules. So this idea that you can invent a currency that wins out, it's nonsense. It won't. But it's a great technology. It has great uses.
I love the idea of it, though. Professor, thanks a lot for coming on. That was interesting.
Thank you very much for having me.
The Winter Olympics are quickly approaching, and this year we may be seeing some transgender athletes competing. Will they have an unfair advantage? We'll talk to a transgender athlete next on Tucker Carlson Tonight. We have an update in the saga of seat-snatching Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee of Texas. Earlier this week, United Airlines passenger Jean Marie Simon was exiled to an economy seat, despite buying a first-class ticket. Then she saw her seat handed over to Sheila Jackson Lee. That was bad enough, but after Miss Simon complained, Jackson Lee issued a statement suggesting Simon was racist, even to object. Needless to say, that's not true at all. It turns out Miss Simon is a human rights activist who spent much of her life campaigning on behalf of poor Guatemalans. Sheila Jackson Lee, meanwhile, has spent her life campaigning for re-election, playing the race card, and becoming a notoriously unpleasant airline passenger in the process. Who would you side with? The 2018 Winter Olympics in South Korea are just about a month away, and if any transgender athletes seek to compete, they'll be welcomed with open arms. IOC rules allow for transgender athletes to compete as their preferred gender. A biological male winning a gold medal in a women's event now seems a matter of when, not if. Joanna Harper is transgendered and an athlete, and argues that transgender competitors don't enjoy any advantage. Joanna, there are a lot of people who in this age of gender fluidity take a relaxed view of it and accept that you can choose which bathroom to use and all that, but that when it comes to sport, when it comes to who's the fastest, who's the strongest, when you're running around a 400-meter track, that basically, from gender fluidity, we're back to two biological sexes in which those who are born male have a distinct advantage. Where are they going wrong on that?
Well, first of all, biology is actually quite complex. And so to suggest that that biology is dimorphic is incorrect. But it is certainly true that people who have gone through male puberty especially do have substantial advantages. And to be clear, the IOC rules say that transgender women can only compete in women's sports after they have gone through a year of low testosterone due to hormone therapy. And that actually changes many biological characteristics, and especially those characteristics that are important for sport. But and the second thing I'd like to say is that I've always admitted that transgender women have advantages over cisgender or typical women, but also disadvantages too. And the important question is, can the two groups compete against one another equitably and meaningfully?
Well, let's look at the tests and the testing that you mentioned. where they say you have to, and maybe you can actually explain this in layman's terms. You're a scientist, you understand a lot of this, but lowering testosterone. And I think the thing is you have to have your testosterone levels below 10 nanomoles per liter. And if I think about it carefully enough, I can remember what a nanomole was from my school days, if one drops from the ceiling on my head. But 10 nanomoles per liter, as I understand it, something like 90% of female athletes, their testosterone levels are around 3 nanomoles per liter. So in other words, this upper limit is 3 times what would be typical in a female athlete. So it seems like a kind of arbitrary setting unrelated to the realities of the situation.
Well, I actually agree with you there. And in fact, I am part of a committee that has recently recommended that we lower that limit from 10 to 5. And it's important to understand that that's a limit. The vast majority of transgender women will keep their testosterone below 3 and in fact below 2 and usually below 1 nanomole.
Right.
So this is an upper limit, but I absolutely agree. 10 is too high, and our committee has recommended bringing it down to 5.
You mentioned that it's not like a binary boy-girl thing. There was I think she was a South African athlete who competed in the Olympics and the Commonwealth Games a couple of years back, and her fellow female competitors were convinced that at a certain level she was transgendered, and in fact I think the authorities ended up actually testing her to find out whether she was transgendered because her levels were believed to be extraordinarily high. I wonder if we're in danger in the end of just killing women's sport by this kind of micro-regulation of essentially the individual DNA of each participant.
Well, first of all, the athlete in question, Caster Semenya, was almost undoubtedly intersex, which some people may not be familiar with that term, but hermaphrodite is a term that more people might be familiar with. But intersex people have a mix of male and female characteristics, right. And Semenya is almost undoubtedly intersex. So there are different issues than with transgender athletes, and it's important to separate the two. But again, it is important to have fair play. It is important to that introducing intersex and/or transgender athletes does not overly affect the playing field that exists. And transgender athletes in particular are hugely underrepresented in women's sports.
Well, we'll see.
In other words, if you were to look at the population of transgender athletes, you would expect that there would be a lot more athletes than there actually are.
Well, we'll see where that ends up, Joanna. It may well be that men and women just end up running around the track altogether and there aren't these separate events anymore. First, the left agitated over racist trees, as we reported yesterday. Now, another tree controversy, this one involving the first family. That's next.